I gave up everything to raise my son, but the day I lost my job, he looked me in the eye and called me a burden. In the very house I bought for him, he told me I was useless. I thought nothing could hurt more until I revealed a secret I'd kept for years, and his reaction shattered me in a way I never saw coming. For 30 years, I gave my life to my son, Ethan. I worked long hours, sacrificed my own dreams, even gave up my marriage just so he could have a better life. Every decision I made was for him, his education, his comfort, his future, but all of that came crashing down the day I told him I lost my job. Instead of showing concern, his first words were cold and sharp. "So now you're just gonna freeload off us?" He didn't even blink. The sting of his words cut deeper than I expected. He called me a parasite, a burden. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be the kind of mother who let her child walk all over her. Not anymore. He didn't know the full story, not yet. He had no idea that my late employer, Catherine, the woman I had loyally served for years, had left me a massive inheritance, $8 million. But I didn't tell him. Not then. When I came home that day and told him I was no longer working for Catherine, he looked at me like I was insane. "Why would you quit? That was $8,000 a month. What are you planning to do now? Just sit around and let us carry you?" I had returned home hoping to support them, to help with the house, maybe even assist during Nicole's pregnancy. But their reactions made it clear they didn't see me as family. They saw me as a paycheck. Nicole, my daughter-in-law, didn't waste time showing her disdain. Her lips curled in that familiar smirk as she said, "Postpartum recovery requires professional care. You used to be a housekeeper. What could you possibly know about it?" Before I could even answer, her mother Susan chimed in. "Newborn care is a science. It requires education and experience, not just cleaning floors." Their dismissive tone didn't surprise me anymore. I was used to it. I'd been quietly enduring their insults and judgment for years. But this time, it hit different. I had come home to offer help, not to be humiliated. So, I smiled. Not out of warmth, but as a way to keep the peace. "If everything's arranged, I won't interfere," I said. "You'll handle the baby care." Susan nodded approvingly. "Fine, but you'll need to pay your share." Then, she said she'd take care of hiring a nanny and a baby nurse for a price. Of course. Ethan jumped in, his voice urgent. "Our expenses are about to double. You should stay at your job." It became clear they never wanted me to rest. They just wanted me to keep working so I could help pay their bills. I looked at Ethan, stunned. I was 58. I had been working nonstop since my early 20s. Was it so wrong to want to retire and rest? Nicole scoffed. "You don't even have a pension. What retirement are you talking about?" Her words slapped me harder than any physical blow. Years ago, they had begged me to put every cent into paying off their mortgage instead of saving for retirement. And now, they were mocking me for not having a plan? "You should have planned better," Nicole snapped. "We told you the house was too expensive for you to buy alone." At that point, Ethan tried to smooth things over. "Nicole's just upset. She's trying to get pregnant, and all this stress isn't helping." But then he looked at me, frustration flickering in his eyes. "We really need the money, Mom. You're healthy. There's no reason you can't work another 20 years. 20 more years? That was their vision for me? Not a mother, not a person, just a machine that brought in money. That's when it all started to click: the years of sacrifice, the extra shifts, the handmade crafts sold just to buy Ethan a decent jacket. None of it had earned their respect. Gratitude was a fantasy I had created in my own mind. Back when Ethan was in college, I had moved to another city just to work as a live-in housekeeper so I could save up and buy them a house. I put their names on the deed, not mine, and they swore they'd take care of me when they were better off. But better off never came. What came instead was entitlement. I drew a deep breath and said, calm but firm, "I've decided to retire. No one gets to decide that for me." Susan's demeanor changed. She softened her voice and said, "There's no extra room here. You can't expect to stay forever." That's when Nicole re-entered the conversation, smug as ever. There's a nice senior residence nearby. Meals, housing. And if you work in the kitchen, you get a discounted stay. It could help us all. I clenched my teeth. They wanted me to clean floors in a retirement home to earn my keep after everything? When I refused, Susan's mask slipped. You're not exactly the type who needs rest. Working again wouldn't kill you. I held my ground. I'm done working in anyone's house. Period. Then, in a tone laced with finality, she added, if you don't want to work or help out, we'll need you to move out. My voice trembled as I looked at Ethan. You're okay with sending me to a senior home to clean floors? So I can eat? He avoided my eyes. You've always wanted to be independent, so go live that way. Support yourself, Mom. Then he picked up his phone. There's an opening right now. I called earlier. They said you could move in today. That's when my heart finally broke. I had given everything for this boy. I bought him a house, gave him an education, worked till my body ached and my spirit cracked. And now he was ready to ship me off like some broken appliance. Tears welled up, my hands trembled. Ethan, I whispered, I gave everything for you. I drained my savings to buy you a home. And now you call me a burden? For just a second? I saw guilt in his eyes, but it vanished. You think you suffered? That was your choice, he snapped. You ruined everything when you divorced Dad. I could have grown up rich. You owe me for the rest of your life. I stood frozen, staring into his bloodshot eyes. I felt like something inside me had been ripped open, slowly, painfully. He didn't know. He had no idea. Ethan wasn't even my biological son. I found him when he was just a year old, abandoned in a dumpster, barely alive, lips blue from a congenital heart defect. I adopted him when no one else would. I chose him. I fought for his life when doctors said he wouldn't make it. My husband left because he didn't want to raise someone else's child. But I stayed. I worked 3 jobs, sewed clothes at night, cleaned houses by day. And when he finally grew healthy, when he smiled and ran and played like other kids, I thought I had done something good. I never told Ethan the truth. I didn't want him to carry the shame of being abandoned. I wanted him to feel loved, protected. But now, he stood before me, screaming that I owed him, blaming me for every hardship, acting like my sacrifices were worthless. I pressed a hand to my chest, the pain overwhelming. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer my son. This was someone else entirely. I stood there in silence, heart pounding, trying to steady my breath as Ethan stormed off. The words he threw at me echoed in my mind accusations, blame, entitlement. He was gone from the room, but the bitterness he left behind lingered like a stench. I sank onto the edge of the couch, numb. The room felt colder than it had before, even though the windows were shut. Everything I had done for Ethan, every sacrifice I had made to give him a chance at life, had been twisted into a weapon he now used against me. What made it all worse was that he had no idea the truth, not just about his adoption, but the fortune I now had access to. Catherine, my employer for over 20 years, had quietly left me $8 million in her will, her final gift of gratitude and love. And yet, despite sitting on a small fortune, I had come back to help my son and his family, not to flaunt my wealth or seek payback, but to support them as a mother. That was the bitter irony. They saw me as a burden, while I had returned with the full intention of easing their burden. I had hoped for warmth. Instead, I got rejection. I needed air. I stepped outside, walking down the street, unsure of where I was headed, just anywhere that didn't feel like betrayal. My feet carried me to a quiet park, not far from their house. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I sat on a bench and let myself breathe. My thoughts turned to Ethan's childhood, back when he was fragile, clinging to life. I remembered sitting in emergency rooms, praying he'd make it through the night. Remembered counting coins just to afford his medication. Remembered singing lullabies to calm his pain. I remembered a little boy who once clung to my hand and said, "You're the best mama in the world." Where had that child gone? The next day, I called a lawyer. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't say a word to Nicole or Susan. Quietly, I began the process of reclaiming what was legally mine: the house I had paid for, the documents I had signed, the money I had funneled into their lives. It was time to draw the line, time to take back what I had earned and been robbed of. When I met with the lawyer, she was a kind, middle-aged woman named Janice. She had sharp eyes and a firm voice. I explained everything, and to my surprise, she didn't seem shocked at all. "I've seen this before," she said. "Not this exact story, of course, but entitled children, manipulative in-laws. People who forget where they came from." I handed her the deed. "It's in Ethan and Nicole's name, but I paid for the house, every cent." She flipped through the documents. "Do you have proof of payment?" "Yes. Receipts, bank statements, transfers." She nodded. "Then we have a case." It wouldn't be easy. The legal process would be long and messy. But I was no longer afraid of conflict. I had spent too many years avoiding it for the sake of peace. Now I knew better. Peace built on disrespect is not peace, it's silence. And silence, when it becomes your only voice, eventually poisons you. A week later, I checked into a hotel. It was a 5-star place downtown, with thick carpets and crisp sheets. I hadn't stayed anywhere this nice in my entire life, but I didn't feel guilty. I was done living like I owed the world for simply existing. From that hotel room, I began looking for a new place to live. A real home, not a house I was allowed to stay in. A place that was mine in name, spirit, and freedom. I toured a gated villa community with beautiful landscaping and polished stone walkways. It was the kind of place Nicole would drool over. Funny how life turns, isn't it? The showroom was bustling with potential buyers. I had an appointment, and as I walked in, I recognized the woman at the front desk, Chloe. She was Susan's niece. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me, and then narrowed in a sneer. "Margaret?" she said, barely hiding her disdain. "You're here to tour a property?" I smiled politely. "Yes," she laughed. "You know these homes start at 7 figures, right?" "I do. I mean, you were a housekeeper, right?" "These places are a little out of range." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I let her talk herself into embarrassment. She waved over security, loudly suggesting that non-serious buyers should be asked to leave. A manager intervened, a young man named Alex, who tried to smooth things over. "Do you have financial verification?" I opened my folder and handed him proof bank statements, trust documents, everything. His eyebrows rose. Chloe's jaw dropped. "I'm buying today," I said simply. "Let Monica show me the property." Monica was a young saleswoman who had quietly been observing. She stepped forward nervously, grateful and stunned that I'd requested her. I toured 2 villas that day, fell in love with one, and signed the paperwork on the spot. When I returned to the office, Chloe was still fuming, her arms crossed. Then I turned to Monica and said, "Actually, I'd like to buy one more." Her eyes widened. Chloe's face went pale. "I'd like you to process it," I added to Monica. "You've been nothing but professional." That day, I signed for 2 luxury villas paid in full. For a long time, I'd been seen as a servant, a background character in other people's stories. But that day, I wrote a new chapter for myself. One where I wasn't just standing in the background, I was center stage, reclaiming my dignity. And Chloe? She was fired on the spot. Her gossip, her arrogance, her disrespect had finally caught up to her. I didn't even need to press charges, but I did leave a note for the HR department, along with a copy of her verbal insults. It felt peaceful. That evening, back at my hotel, I received a call from Ethan. I didn't pick up. Then he sent a message. "I heard what you did. Buying houses to prove a point? Real mature." I blocked him. I wasn't proving anything. I was healing. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved just to protect your peace? Let me know below. The morning after I finalized the purchase of both villas, I woke up to the golden light of the city pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel room. For the first time in years, there was no weight in my chest, no anxiety waiting to pounce the moment I opened my eyes. Just quiet. I sat at the window with my coffee, letting the aroma and warmth ground me. That moment felt like a reset, a rare gift after decades of sacrifice. But peace, as I had come to learn, doesn't last long when you're connected to people who feed on chaos. Later that afternoon, the hotel concierge knocked on my door with a confused expression. "Ma'am," he said, "this was left at the front desk for you." He held out a massive bouquet of red roses, dozens of them, pristine, expensive, dramatic. I frowned. Tucked between the blooms was a small, cream-colored envelope. I opened it carefully. The card read, "Wishing you a beautiful weekend. I love you, Ethan." I almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully transparent. After everything, after his screaming, accusations, kicking over my suitcase, and practically throwing me out, he thought a bouquet would fix it? Or maybe he thought I'd be flattered, manipulated into softening. A mother's heart can only take so much, right? I took a photo of the bouquet, crushed petals and all, and dropped it straight into the hotel's trash bin. Then I sent that photo to the concierge. "If anything else arrives from Ethan," I texted, "please reject it," and sent him this image. The next day, he was waiting at the gated community where my villa was located. He stood just outside the gate, holding an umbrella in one hand and a thermos in the other, putting on the picture of remorse. I didn't get out of the car. I told my driver to go through the private entrance. The next day, he was there again, and again the next. He came every single morning, rain or shine, sometimes just pacing, sometimes sobbing into his hands like a scene from a bad soap opera. Once, I saw him fall to his knees on the pavement, yelling through the gate, "Mom, please don't hate me. I was wrong. I messed up. I need you." But that wasn't a son seeking forgiveness. That was a man who'd lost his meal ticket. He didn't ask how I was doing. He never mentioned what he'd said to me or the house he tried to claim. No apology, just performance. Eventually, I hired a full-time driver and began using the underground garage entrance. I no longer saw him, not his gestures, not his pleading. He became a shadow, a faint nuisance I refused to acknowledge. 2 weeks of silence followed. I almost believed he had given up, until the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. A familiar voice, weary and rough, came through the line. "Margaret?" My chest tightened. "Richard?" It had been over 20 years since we last spoke. Richard was Ethan's adoptive father, my ex-husband. "I'm not calling to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I just thought you should know. Ethan found me. He's been asking questions." My heart sank. "What kind of questions?" Richard sighed. "He wanted to know if I was really his father. He said you were lying to him, said I was his only real parent." I stayed quiet. I told him the truth, that I'm not his biological father, that you raised him on your own, that I didn't want him back then. And how did he take it? Not well. But that's not my problem anymore. I gripped the phone tightly. "He's trying to control everything, Richard. He's twisting stories, showing up uninvited, making a scene. He's becoming dangerous." "I figured," Richard replied. "Just wanted to give you a heads up." The call ended. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the city skyline. All those years, I'd protected Ethan from his past, never letting him carry the burden of his abandonment. And this was what I got in return. Not long after, a new nightmare began. Someone sent me a link to a live stream. The title? "How My Mother Abandoned Me." It was Ethan, sitting in a dimly lit room, tearfully recounting a version of our life that I barely recognized. "She never loved me," he said. "She left me alone for years, didn't even help when we were struggling. And now that she's rich, she won't give me a cent." He cried. He raged. He begged for donations, all while painting me as a selfish, cruel, heartless woman who had discarded her own child. The comments were a mess. What kind of mother does that? "My heart breaks for you, Ethan. You deserve better." Worse, he was making money, real money. Donations, sponsorships, and product sales. His pity party had gone viral. I became a meme, the Ice Queen mom spreading across social media like wildfire. People began harassing me online, posting my photos, digging through old public records, leaving hateful messages on my home listing. It was madness. but I refused to be a victim again. That night, I contacted my lawyer. She said, "We can file for content removal, sue for defamation, and demand a public apology." Good. Let's do all of it. But first, I had an idea. I logged on to the same streaming platform, created a channel, titled it, "So This is the Mom Who Abandoned Ethan?" And I went live. Not to argue, not to beg, just to tell the truth. I began by introducing myself calmly. Yes, I'm Margaret. And yes, Ethan is my son adopted, not biological. Then I laid out the facts. I told them about the dumpster, the surgeries, the sleepless nights, the 3 jobs, the house I paid for. I shared scanned receipts, documents, medical records, even a copy of his adoption certificate. Then, in the most composed voice I could muster, I said, "I didn't abandon him. I saved him. And now, he's using lies to make money off my pain." The chat exploded. People were stunned. Many switched sides instantly. "This changes everything. You're a hero." I believed him. "I'm so sorry." By the end of the stream, I had one message pinned. This is not a story of a cold-hearted mother. It's a story of survival, of sacrifice, of love abused. Ethan's career as a fake victim ended overnight. His channel was reported and suspended. My lawyer began the lawsuit. And me? I closed the laptop and took a long breath. It wasn't over. But the tides had finally turned. What would you do if your own child tried to ruin your life for money? Would you fight back or walk away? The fallout from my live stream was immediate. Within hours, Ethan's carefully constructed web of lies began to collapse. His stream was flooded with outraged comments. Viewers who once sent him donations were demanding refunds, accusing him of manipulating their emotions for profit. The tone had completely shifted. I didn't check his channel again, but my lawyer informed me that Ethan had gone live shortly after mine ended. He tried to double down crying, shouting that I was twisting the truth. He called me vindictive, said I was destroying his reputation just to feel superior. But the tide had turned, and once that shift happened, there was no going back. People weren't buying it anymore. The truth was out. The documents, the receipts, the adoption certificate, there was no faking those. I hadn't needed to humiliate him. He'd done that all on his own by lying so brazenly in the first place. The social media platform soon suspended his account for violating terms of service, citing defamation and harassment. His access to donations was cut off, sponsors dropped him, and my lawyer moved swiftly to file formal charges of online defamation and emotional distress, along with demands for legal damages and an injunction to keep him from publicly mentioning me again. It felt like I could finally breathe. But peace, as always, came in fragments. Several weeks after the incident, my legal team managed to do something I didn't think was possible. They reversed the property transfer. The house I had paid for Ethan and Nicole's home, the place they had tried to force me out of, was officially back in my name. It had taken 6 grueling months of legal back and forth, evidence submissions, financial records, and testimonies. But we did it. I didn't celebrate with champagne or fireworks. I just walked into the house quietly one afternoon, ran my hand along the familiar window pane, and let the light wash over the hardwood floor like a blessing. For a moment, I stood there alone, remembering the years I'd poured into that home, the double shifts I'd worked, the times I'd gone without so Ethan could have what he needed, the promises they'd made to care for me when they were finally settled. Empty promises, words evaporated by entitlement. Now, it was mine again, legally and undeniably mine. But the story wasn't finished. While my legal battles were wrapping up, another unexpected development surfaced. Nicole, Ethan's wife. She filed for divorce. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard from our lawyer that she signed the papers quietly, showing little emotion. She answered only when asked a direct question, didn't argue about custody, and simply wanted out. Apparently, the collapse of Ethan's online persona, the backlash from his lies, and the financial ruin he'd dragged them into had finally broken whatever spell she'd been under. I wasn't surprised. Nicole had always been calculating, but she wasn't stupid. She saw a sinking ship and jumped before it dragged her under. What shocked me more was how calm she had become. No longer playing the smug daughter-in-law. No jabs, no disdain, just emptiness. It was as though she had finally seen Ethan for what he truly was, a man who complained endlessly but never took responsibility, who blamed others for his own failures, and who lashed out when life didn't hand him what he thought he deserved. And just like that, Ethan was completely out of my life. He vanished. No calls, no letters, no surprise appearances, just silence. I didn't try to find him. I had nothing left to give, and no part of me felt the urge to reconnect. If anything, I felt free. Years passed. I sold the 2 villas I had impulsively bought during the height of all the chaos. The market had swung upward, and I made a tidy profit from both sales. What once represented defiance and bitterness had transformed into the foundation of my new life. Eventually, I moved to a peaceful lakeside town on the city's western edge. It wasn't the most expensive neighborhood, but it was everything I had longed for: tranquility, safety, and a sense of home that no one could take from me. My new house was modest but elegant. Wide windows bathed the rooms in sunlight. Outside, I tended to a small garden filled with roses, lavender, and wisteria. I spent mornings sipping dark roast coffee while watching the birds flutter through the trees. I had a painting easel set up under a pergola in the backyard, where I let time pass in brushstrokes and soft breezes. For the first time, my name wasn't Mom when someone needed something. No one called to guilt me into working another job, or to demand money for baby supplies, or to remind me of all I owed them. There was no more yelling, no judgment, no empty chairs waiting to be filled at a family dinner that only made me feel invisible. Just me, the wind, and the music I finally had the freedom to create. Sometimes, strangers ask if I regret adopting Ethan. I used to pause at that question. I used to cry at night, wondering if I'd failed or if there had been a better way. But now, I simply shake my head and smile. No, I don't regret it. I regret not learning sooner that being kind shouldn't come at the cost of your own destruction. I regret thinking love was enough to change someone who never wanted to be changed. But I don't regret giving a child a chance at life, even if he threw it away, because in the end, what I gave was real. And what he lost? That was his choice. My life now is quieter, simpler, and far more meaningful. I no longer fight to prove my worth. I no longer shrink myself to fit inside someone else's version of love. I've become the woman I should have always been, someone who values her peace more than her pride. And I've learned that the most powerful thing you can ever say to those who hurt you is nothing at all. I thought I had finally closed that painful chapter. After years of sacrifice, betrayal, and heartbreak, I had reclaimed peace. I had my own home again. The truth was out, and I could finally breathe without the weight of being someone else's burden. But life has a way of throwing curveballs just when you think you've made it out. One afternoon, while browsing the local market for fresh vegetables, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. We exchanged pleasantries, caught up briefly on life, and then she mentioned something in passing, something that made my stomach turn. I heard your son moved to Canada. Canada? I hadn't heard a word from Ethan in over a year. He had vanished after the lawsuit, the court ruling, and the collapse of his online platform. I assumed he had either found a new way to manipulate someone else or had simply given up. But Canada? It sparked enough curiosity for me to search his name online when I returned home. I didn't expect to find anything, but I did. There he was, in a video uploaded by a passerby on a social media site. The clip was shaky, the lighting poor, but there was no mistaking him. Ethan, my son, was hunched over a trash can behind a convenience store, rummaging through discarded food. He looked thinner, his clothes tattered, his eyes unfocused. Every now and then, he would smile wide, manic, vacant. Moments later, he'd break into loud sobs, his entire body shaking as if he were trapped in an endless breakdown. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, There he was, the same man who had stood in front of a camera accusing me of cruelty, the same man who had turned me into an internet villain, now reduced to a broken shell. And you know what? I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I didn't even feel anger. I felt nothing except a cold, aching sadness. Not for him, but for the years I had lost trying to save someone who had never truly wanted saving, for the sacrifices I'd made in vain, for the mother I used to be, so full of hope, so blind to the truth. Ethan had become exactly what he had feared most, a man without family, without love, without purpose, a ghost on the margins of real life. It didn't matter anymore how much money he had lost or how many followers had abandoned him. No amount of online fame or sympathy could change what he had become. His downfall wasn't just financial, it was moral, emotional, spiritual, and it had nothing to do with me. It was all his own doing. I closed the video. I didn't save it. I didn't share it. I didn't speak of it again. The past was done. In the months that followed, I focused entirely on building my new life. The 2 villas I had bought, once symbols of anger and rebellion, I sold at a peak market value, turning a profit that surprised even me. The money didn't excite me. What excited me was the freedom it gave me to begin anew. I moved into a quiet home by the lake. It wasn't the largest, nor the flashiest, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every curtain, every garden stone was chosen by me, for me. I painted in the mornings, took long walks in the afternoons, and cooked for myself in the evenings, not because anyone needed me to, but because I finally had time to enjoy it. I no longer had to answer to anyone. I was no longer just mom, or just the housekeeper, or just a bank account. I was a woman with her own name, her own space, and her own story. But peace didn't mean isolation. In the neighborhood, I made a few quiet friends, people my age, some retired, others like me, simply done with the noise. We shared stories, we laughed over coffee, and we gave each other something priceless, understanding. One neighbor, a retired nurse named Helen, asked me one day what my biggest regret was. I thought long and hard before answering. I don't regret adopting Ethan, I said, but I do regret letting guilt control my life for so long. That guilt, the endless need to do more, be more, give more, had taken years from me. It had fed Ethan's entitlement. It had allowed people like Susan and Nicole to walk all over me. It had made me feel like I didn't deserve rest, or peace, or love. But not anymore. Now, I know that love does not equal servitude, that motherhood is not martyrdom, that boundaries are not cruelty, they're survival. And finally, I could live by that truth. I never heard from Susan again, not once. Perhaps she was too embarrassed. Or maybe deep down, she knew there was nothing more to gain. Nicole remained quiet as well. After the divorce, she kept her distance. I sometimes wondered if she had learned anything from the wreckage she helped create, but I never reached out. That chapter was over. As for Ethan, the last I heard, he'd checked into a community shelter in a small town in Ontario. A social worker emailed me, letting me know he was receiving some help. I didn't respond. I don't hate him, but I no longer pity him either. He made his choices, and now I was making mine. The past will always be a part of me. The sacrifices, the heartbreak, the lessons they've shaped me, but they no longer define me. I've grown, I've healed, and for the first time in decades, I've chosen myself. The woman who once worked herself to the bone for others now spends her mornings sipping coffee under the wisteria vines, watching the sunlight dance across the lake. And that, to me, is more than enough. The lake breeze carried a gentle calm, rustling the trees outside my window and lulling me into a peaceful routine I'd never thought possible years ago. I had truly begun to settle into this new phase of life. Mornings were filled with quiet reflection, music, and painting. Evenings were for books and soft lamplight. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was truly living. But even in peace, the past has its ways of whispering through cracks. One sunny afternoon, as I browsed through a nearby piano showroom, something I'd started doing for fun. I found myself face to face with a woman from my former life. It was Susan. Her appearance was just as I remembered: neatly styled hair, designer clothes, and an ever-present look of superiority. She hadn't seen me at first, and I debated quietly slipping away before she noticed. But fate wasn't on my side that day. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "Margaret, I didn't expect to see you in a place like this." I didn't flinch. "Why not?" I replied calmly. Susan chuckled, eyeing me from head to toe. "Well, it's just, you know, these pianos are a bit out of reach for someone who cleans." I could see her little entourage watching from behind, whispering, smirking. They were clearly waiting for a show. I walked over to a grand piano and gently lifted the lid, running my fingers across the keys. Without responding to her insult, I sat down and began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece I had learned with the help of my late employer, Catherine. Her generosity in teaching me music had left a mark deeper than I ever realized. The melody filled the room, silencing even the most judgmental stares. By the time I finished, I noticed several people around me had stopped to listen, some even applauding quietly. Susan looked genuinely stunned. "That was unexpected," she muttered. I smiled. "You'd be surprised what people like me can do when we're not being belittled every day." Just then, a salesperson approached. "MAAM, that was incredible. Are you looking to purchase today?" Before I could answer, Susan jumped in. "She's just browsing," she sneered. "Probably here to get some free coffee and pretend for a few minutes." The salesperson looked uncomfortable, but I answered before he could respond. "I'd actually like to buy this piano," I said. "Can we begin the paperwork?" Gasps rippled through the room. Susan's face went pale. "You're joking," she said, laughing nervously. "You? Afford this?" Rather than argue, I took out my bank card and handed it to the associate. The full amount, today. Even the employee hesitated for a second before nodding and beginning the transaction. Susan's little crowd looked like they'd swallowed lemons. Her face, flushed with humiliation, twitched with disbelief. "You're bluffing," she whispered. "Then you'll enjoy watching me sign the receipt." I had nothing to prove anymore, but showing people like Susan that their cruelty hadn't broken me. It felt poetic. As the receipt printed and the transaction was confirmed, I looked directly at her. "I may have worked for others once, Susan, but the life I have now, I built it, and no one will take it away again." She didn't say another word. I left the showroom with the confirmation of delivery in my bag and my dignity firmly intact. That encounter might have ended there, but whispers of it spread quickly. I later learned Susan had told everyone she knew that I'd somehow conned someone into giving me money. She couldn't believe I had earned any of it on my own. In her eyes, if someone she deemed less than succeeded, it had to be a scam. But people talk. And stories twist. It wasn't long before I began hearing murmurs around town. Strangers gave me odd looks. Some congratulated me with smiles. Others kept their distance. Then one day, something strange happened. My concierge handed me a bouquet of flowers. No sender name, just a small card. "I'm sorry. I miss you. Love, Ethan." I nearly laughed aloud. It was so absurd, so hollow, that I immediately tossed the flowers in the trash. I snapped a photo of the crumpled bouquet and card and forwarded it to my concierge. "Please refuse anything from this person in the future," I instructed. "No exceptions." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Ethan began showing up outside the gates of my community. He would stand there, sometimes holding signs, sometimes crying, occasionally kneeling on the sidewalk like a broken man from some melodramatic play. One time, I caught sight of him through the tinted windows of my car as my driver pulled out of the driveway. He was yelling through tears, "Mom, please don't be like this. I'm your son." I didn't stop. I didn't even roll down the window. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Eventually, I had to ask the security team to issue a trespassing warning. That put an end to the visits for a while. Then he switched tactics again. This time, he reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, my ex-husband, Richard. Yes, Richard, the man who gave me an ultimatum all those years ago. Send Ethan back to the orphanage or raise him alone. The man who walked away from us both. He called out of the blue one evening. I just thought you should know, he said, his voice calm but strained. Ethan tracked me down. He's asking questions and making demands. I felt my stomach drop. What did you tell him? Richard sighed. I told him the truth, that I'm not his biological father, that I haven't been part of your lives for decades, that he should leave you alone. Did you tell him everything? No, just enough to get him to stop. But Margaret, he's desperate, angry. I think he's losing control. I thanked Richard and hung up. I hadn't expected him to protect me, but it was the first time in forever that he hadn't made things worse. Still, I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear of Ethan, not by a long shot, and I was right. Because what Ethan did next crossed a line I never thought he'd go near. Have you ever had someone twist your kindness into weakness? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts below. The first sign that something was off came in the form of strangers' stares. I noticed them at the grocery store, in the cafe, and even during my walks by the lake. Their eyes lingered, their smiles were uneasy, and some whispered just out of earshot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then Monica, the young real estate agent who helped me with my home, called. Margaret, have you been online lately? She asked, her tone cautious. No, I replied. Why? She hesitated. I think you should know your son, Ethan. He's live streaming daily. And it's about you. I paused. What do you mean? He's been sharing this emotional sob story about being abandoned, about you leaving him behind now that you're rich. It's getting traction. I thanked her and hung up, my heart heavy. When I finally brought myself to check, I was stunned. There he was on a platform I'd barely heard of, crying in front of thousands. The stream was titled, How My Mother Abandoned Me. The comments section was flooded with sympathy. Poor guy. How could a mother do that? She left him just because she got rich? I'd give anything for a son like that. In his videos, Ethan spun a heartbreaking tale. He claimed I had stopped supporting him out of spite, that I had never helped him through college, that I didn't contribute to his wedding, that I didn't care when Nicole got pregnant, that I had cut him off when he needed me most. Worst of all, he played the victim perfectly. He'd pause to wipe away a tear, sigh heavily, and gaze longingly into the camera like a wounded soul begging to be loved. And people believed it. Some viewers even sent him money. He launched merchandise. T-shirts, mugs, keychains plastered with his heartbroken son slogans. Donations poured in. His follower count soared, and my reputation? It plummeted. People started doxing me. My full name, address, even photos of my home began circulating online. I had become a meme, a monster, the cold mother who abandoned her son after striking it rich. I wanted to scream. Instead, I called my lawyer. We can file for removal of defamatory content, she told me. Issue a cease and desist. Sue for damages and defamation. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to hide. I created a new account on the same platform Ethan used. I named the channel, So This Is the Mom Who Abandoned Ethan. My profile picture was a calm, composed photo of me sipping tea in my garden. I sent Ethan a donation of several $1,000s during his next live stream just to get his attention and wrote a simple message. Want to hear the truth? Come to my stream tonight. First 500 viewers get a $100 giveaway. The message lit up his chat. People flocked to my new stream. When I went live that night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't rant. I simply told the truth. Yes, I began. I stopped supporting Ethan financially, but not out of cruelty, out of necessity, out of self-preservation. I went on to explain my journey. The years I worked multiple jobs to raise him, the sacrifices, the house I bought with my own hands and savings only to be kicked out and asked to become a servant again. I showed the trust documents from Catherine, the woman who left me the inheritance. I even shared hospital bills, tuition receipts, photos from Ethan's childhood. This is the reality, I said, not the edited version Ethan crafted. The comments started flying. She raised him alone? She bought him a house? He kicked her out? What the hell? Then I shared the biggest truth of all. I adopted Ethan when he was abandoned in a dumpster as a baby, I said. His birth parents left him to die. I chose him. I saved him. More receipts, medical records, the adoption certificate. I had everything. The chat exploded. He's not even her biological son? She raised him out of pure love. And he did this? He used her, then turned on her. People were stunned. Many went back to Ethan's channel and began flooding his comments with backlash. How could you lie like that? She saved your life. You're a disgrace. His face on camera was pale, drawn, unrecognizable. He tried to defend himself, saying, "Even if I'm adopted, she still chose to leave me. She ruined my life." But it was too late. The damage was done. The platform suspended his account within 48 hours. His merch store was pulled, and my lawyer served him with legal documents, cease and desist, defamation lawsuit, and harassment injunction. I didn't want his money, but I wanted the truth to win. And it did. The court ruled in my favor. Ethan was ordered to remove all defamatory content, pay my legal fees, and issue a formal apology or face further consequences. He vanished from the public eye after that. No more live streams. No more drama. Just silence. A few months later, I reclaimed my house. My legal team had done the impossible, proven ownership, revoked the false documents Nicole had filed, and restored everything in my name. I walked back into my old home and felt a strange calm settle in my bones. The sun filtered through the windows, the hardwood floor gleamed, and I knew this was truly my space again. Nicole, now estranged from Ethan, had quietly signed divorce papers. Her composure told me she had finally seen the real man. She married a boy clinging to resentment, blind to his own reflection. As for Ethan, I heard whispers. Some said he left the country. Canada? Maybe. I didn't look for him. But one day, over coffee with an old friend, I saw a video circulating on a small, anonymous blog. Grainy footage. A man, hunched over a trash can, digging through scraps. It was Ethan. Hair unkempt, clothes torn, his eyes wild and distant. He rocked back and forth, muttering to himself. At moments, he'd laugh maniacally, then burst into tears. He looked like a ghost of himself, a ghost made from greed, lies, and wasted love. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing. He was the sum of his choices, and I was free. Have you ever had someone twist your truth to play the victim? Share how you rose above it in the comments. The calm that followed Ethan's downfall felt almost surreal. After years of chaos, heartbreak, and betrayal, life was finally settling into something peaceful. The media buzz faded. The online drama lost its fire. My name was no longer a trending hashtag. I'd returned to something I hadn't felt in years' normalcy. I decided it was time to leave the past behind, both physically and emotionally. I sold the 2 villas I had purchased during the whirlwind of anger and retribution. The housing market was in my favor, and I made a generous profit. But more importantly, I let go of what those villas symbolized: the defiance, the pain, and the desperate need to prove something. I moved to a small lakeside town on the edge of the city. It was quiet, filled with older residents like me, and had a warmth that no amount of luxury could replace. My new home was a modest cottage surrounded by wisteria and roses. The morning smelled of dark roast coffee, and soft sunlight streamed through my windows. My easel sat beneath the trees, waiting patiently for the next afternoon I'd spend painting in peace. There was no more knocking at my door, no more pleading calls, no more staged breakdowns on my doorstep. Just the soft rustle of the leaves and the occasional chirp of birds outside my window. I was finally just Margaret, not mom, not bank, not villain, just me. Sometimes neighbors would stop by during their morning walks. We'd chat about flowers, local shops, and the weather. No one asked me about my past, and I didn't offer it. I smiled more often. I slept more soundly. For the first time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else's comfort or expectations. Occasionally, a neighbor or an old acquaintance would ask, "Do you ever regret adopting Ethan?" It was a question that used to tie me in emotional knots. But now, I'd simply smile and say, "No, I don't regret choosing love. I only regret choosing silence when I should have stood up for myself sooner." Love isn't a mistake, but letting it be taken for granted again and again is. With time, I also came to understand something deeper. Self-defense is not cruelty. Choosing peace isn't abandonment. And sometimes, walking away is the only way to heal. Still, there were days when memories crept in. I'd remember Ethan as a toddler, clinging to my legs with wide, scared eyes. Or the nights I stayed up sewing clothes for him, praying I could make ends meet. I'd remember the proud look on his face when he got into college, and how I worked extra hours just to send him a little money each month. Then those memories would be tainted by the sound of his voice, shouting at me, accusing me of ruining his life, of owing him everything I had. Those were the days I spent longer at the piano, letting the music speak what I couldn't put into words. One afternoon, I wandered into a local music shop. There was a vintage grand piano tucked into the corner, its ivory keys slightly worn. I ran my fingers across the surface, then played a few quiet notes. "That's beautiful," a young voice said behind me. I turned to see a girl, no older than 12, watching me with awe. "Do you play?" I asked her. "Just started learning, but I want to play like that someday." I smiled and offered her my seat. She hesitated, then sat beside me. I taught her a few simple chords. She lit up with excitement. That moment meant more to me than any concert, any applause, any praise. It reminded me that while people may break our hearts, life always offers us someone new to share our kindness with. That's what I held on to giving, without destroying myself in the process. Not long after that, I was invited to a local community center to teach a beginner's music class. Just twice a week, nothing formal. I accepted. It was a chance to connect, to share, and to keep my heart open, but this time, with boundaries and balance. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, a familiar name popped into conversation. I was having lunch at a cafe when a woman at the next table said, "I heard Susan's daughter finally finalized the divorce." That poor woman? What a mess. My ears perked up. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. She's been living with her mom again. But word is Susan's health is declining. Karma, maybe? It was the first I'd heard about them in a long time. Part of me was tempted to reach out, but the wiser part of me knew better. Closure doesn't always come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to reopen wounds. I focused on my own days, my own choices, and the beautiful life I was building now. But, as fate would have it, I did run into someone from my past. I had gone downtown to browse a music store's grand piano selection. My old piano had finally given out. As I walked through the glass doors, admiring the display, a voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the famous Margaret Turner." It was Susan. Her face carried more lines, her posture more stiffness. Her once piercing voice was lower now, but still full of bite. "I heard you made quite a splash," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "Big house, expensive piano, luxury cars. Not bad for a maid." I didn't respond. I simply smiled and kept browsing. "You know," she added, "Nicole's having a hard time. She could really use some support." I turned to face her, calm and composed. "Susan," I said, "support is earned, not owed. And Nicole has burned every bridge she ever walked across." She tried to scoff, but there was no strength behind it. She was tired, worn down, defeated. "You're cold," she muttered. "No," I replied softly. "I'm finally warm for myself." And with that, I walked away. Outside the store, the sky was a gentle gray, the air cool and calm. I wrapped my scarf around my shoulders and smiled. Life had taught me many lessons, some painful, some profound. But the greatest one of all? Sometimes, love is not enough to save a person. And sometimes, saving yourself is the only love that truly matters. Peace doesn't mean forgetting it, just means learning to live without the weight of the past crushing your chest. That's something I reminded myself often as the seasons turned in my new lakeside town. Days grew longer, my garden bloomed, and the quiet became my favorite song. But of course, Life always has a way of circling back. One early morning, just as the sun painted gold across the water, the gatehouse rang. The concierge informed me someone had dropped off flowers. Again, I hadn't received anything in months, so I hesitated. But curiosity got the better of me. The bouquet was elaborate. Fresh peonies and lilies, clearly expensive. Tucked between the stems was a small white envelope. I opened it slowly, wishing you a peaceful weekend. Love always, Ethan. I nearly laughed out loud. The audacity. After everything, after all the damage and humiliation, he was still trying to worm his way back into my life. No apology, no acknowledgement of the harm he caused. Just a hollow gesture wrapped in roses. Without a second thought, I threw the bouquet straight into the kitchen trash. Then I snapped a photo of the mangled flowers and the crumpled note, sent it to the concierge, and instructed, from now on, reject anything from this sender, and feel free to pass him this picture. I wasn't just drawing a boundary, I was fortifying a wall. For a while, that worked. No more flowers, no more texts, until he escalated. He started waiting outside the gated community. Rain or shine, morning or night, there he was, lurking, sometimes pacing, sometimes sitting on the sidewalk like a heartbroken child. At first, I ignored him, but it quickly became unsettling. One day, I saw him from the car window as I returned home. He dropped to his knees on the concrete, sobbing theatrically. "Mom, please, I'm sorry, come home." I was wrong. I stared straight ahead, unmoved. His performance didn't break me. It nauseated me. The same boy who had kicked my suitcase, accused me of ruining his life, and tried to evict me from my own home, was now wailing at my feet like a lost soul. Eventually, I hired a full-time driver. I didn't want to walk past him, speak to him, or even see him. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done, but Ethan wasn't. 2 weeks later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a deep, gravelly voice I hadn't heard in decades said, "Margaret?" I froze. "Richard?" I asked cautiously. "Yes. I figured you should hear it from me." Ethan reached out. My ex-husband. Ethan's adoptive father. A man who walked away from us decades ago because he wanted a biological child, not someone else's. I hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years. He showed up at my office, Richard continued, made a scene, claimed the first ruined his life, said I owed him answers. So, I had to take a paternity test. I didn't speak. I didn't tell him everything, he added, his voice quiet. But now he knows I'm not his biological father. He was devastated. I sighed. He's not a child anymore, Richard. We don't need to protect him from truths he's chosen to ignore. I know, he replied. I just thought you should know what's coming. I thanked him and hung up. Sure enough, days later, the storm hit. But not in person. No, this time it came online. A neighbor rang me in the afternoon. Margaret, have you seen what your son's posting? I hadn't, but when I checked, my jaw clenched. Ethan had launched a live stream channel. Title, How My Mother Abandoned Me. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, crocodile tears streaming, painting himself as the broken child left behind. He told thousands of viewers how I had cut him off after becoming rich, how I'd never truly loved him, and how I disappeared when he needed me most. He twisted every sacrifice I had ever made into cruelty. Every distance I kept for self-preservation, he framed as betrayal. I didn't even want her money, he sobbed. I just wanted her love. But behind him, viewers could see the shelves stacked with merchandise mugs, shirts, phone cases, all branded with sad slogans like, abandoned but strong. It wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was monetized victimhood, and people fell for it. Donations rolled in. Commenters cried for him. Some even called me a monster in his chat. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't ashamed, because I had the truth, and the truth doesn't tremble. That same night, I called my lawyer. She confirmed we could pursue legal action for defamation and harassment. But I had another idea first. I signed up for the same streaming platform, created a channel under the name, So This Is the Mom Who Abandoned Ethan. I joined his stream under a pseudonym and quietly donated a few $1,000s, just enough to be noticed. His eyes lit up. Wow, generous supporter. Thank you. Then came the message I sent across the screen. I'm the mother you claim abandoned you. Join my stream for the full story. The chat exploded. Curiosity lit the digital wildfire. Within an hour, my channel had thousands of live viewers. I sat down calmly, wearing a plain blouse, hair tied back, no makeup, just truth. I began, yes, I cut ties with my son. But here's why. I told my story not with anger, but with clarity. I showed hospital bills, tuition payments, the mortgage I paid off for his home. I explained how he and his wife tried to manipulate me into becoming their live-in servant, how they tried to steal the house I'd bought with my own money. And finally, I revealed the trust. Over $8 million left to me by my late employer, not because I asked for it, but because I was loved and respected for my loyalty and hard work. The chat turned. Thousands of comments poured in. She gave him everything. He used her and played the victim. She's a hero, not a villain. I ended the stream by displaying one final piece of proof, the official adoption certificate. My name, clear as day. Ethan wasn't just my son legally, he was the child I chose to love with everything I had. What came next was inevitable. The backlash on Ethan was swift and brutal. His comments section was flooded. His merch store was slammed with refund requests. His follower count plummeted. And a few days later, the platform suspended his account for violating community guidelines. Meanwhile, my lawyer filed the suit. Defamation, harassment, emotional damages. We won. The court ordered Ethan to pay fines and cover all legal expenses. But honestly, that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was silence. His silence. He vanished. No more appearances at the gate. No more live-streamed sob stories. No more emails. Just quiet. I reclaimed my peace. And soon, I would reclaim something else. 6 months after the lawsuit, something unexpected happened, something I once thought impossible. I got my house back. Yes, the very house I paid for. The one Ethan and his wife had claimed as theirs was finally returned to me after a lengthy and grueling legal process. The court reviewed every transaction, every bank statement, every scrap of paperwork that proved I'd poured every ounce of my savings into that property. In the end, justice was served. The ownership was reversed. I still remember the moment I walked back into the house. The living room curtains I'd chosen years ago swayed gently with the breeze, and sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors like golden paint. It was quiet, no shouting, no judgment, no walking on eggshells, just peace. For the first time in decades, I could breathe. Soon after, Ethan's wife, Susan's daughter, filed for divorce. According to my lawyer, she signed the papers in her attorney's office without so much as a word. Cold, resigned, done. I can't say I was surprised. She had always been more in love with the image of a successful husband than the actual man. And once Ethan's lies unraveled, so did the illusion. Maybe she realized she'd married a man who could only play the victim, never the hero. And just like that, Ethan was gone from my life for good. I never tried to find out where he went. I didn't want to. Some things, when lost, shouldn't be found again. Years passed. Life went on. I sold the 2 villas I had impulsively bought after leaving Ethan's house. The real estate market had surged, and I made a tidy profit enough to build a new chapter on a solid foundation. Eventually, I moved to a small lakeside town on the city's edge. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was mine, peaceful, safe. There, my days slowed down in the best way. I tended my garden. I painted at an old easel beneath the shade of wisteria. I brewed my favorite dark roast every morning and watched sunlight spill across my kitchen walls. My past didn't chase me there, it finally let me go. No one called me mom out of convenience anymore. No one accused me of not doing enough. No one drained me dry, emotionally or financially. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. Sometimes people still ask me, Do you regret adopting Ethan? I used to think about that question a lot. I'd lie awake at night, wondering if I had made the wrong choice. But now, I just smile and shake my head. No, I don't regret loving a child who needed love. But I do regret sacrificing myself for people who never intended to love me back. There's a difference between giving and giving yourself away. I learned that the hard way. I spent decades trying to prove I was good enough for Ethan, for Susan, for people who only saw me as useful when I was giving something. But compassion shouldn't cost your dignity. Love shouldn't destroy your sense of self. And boundaries aren't cold, they're life-saving. One quiet afternoon, while chatting with an old friend at a lakeside cafe, she mentioned she'd heard Ethan had left the country. Canada, she thought. He's been bragging online about how free life is over there, she said. Curiosity tugged at me. Later that night, I typed his name into a search bar. What I found made my heart ache, but not in the way I expected. There was a video clip from a local news story. It showed a man who looked vaguely familiar, thinner, more weathered, hunched over a trash can, rummaging for food. His hair was a mess, his clothes torn, his eyes were vacant, unfocused. He cracked a manic smile at something invisible, then began to sob uncontrollably, shaking like a leaf in the wind. It was Ethan, or what was left of him, the same man who once stood tall in front of a camera, painting me as a villain, the man who sold sorrow like merchandise, the one who built a following on lies. Now, he was just a ghost on the margins of real life. And I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. I just felt done. He had become the sum of his choices. No amount of followers, no well-edited live streams, no false narratives could save him from the truth anymore. When the lies crumbled, so did he. Life catches up. It always does. As for me, I let go of that story, the story of pain, of betrayal, of survival. It didn't define me anymore. It shaped me, yes, but it no longer owned me, and I wasn't angry anymore. Instead, I felt a strange gratitude, not for the suffering, but for the clarity that came from surviving it, for the quiet joy of building a life not around sacrifice, but around peace. I began volunteering at a local art center, teaching painting to kids and retirees. I planted more vegetables in my garden. I read more books. I learned to bake bread. I found softness in the everyday. I reclaimed myself not as a mother, not as a servant, not as someone who had to earn love, but as Margaret, just Margaret. And that was more than enough, because healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means no longer being afraid to remember. Sometimes we think strength is holding on, but often the greatest strength is finally letting go. Have you ever had to walk away to protect your peace? I'd love to hear your story. You're not alone in this. Life often teaches us that love, no matter how deep or selfless, should never come at the cost of our dignity or peace. This story reminds us of the importance of setting boundaries, even with those we've sacrificed everything for. As we age, it becomes clearer that true love is not proven by how much we give, but by whether we're respected when we have nothing left to offer. For older adults, many of whom have spent decades putting others first, this story is a powerful affirmation. It's never too late to reclaim your voice, your worth, and your peace. Sometimes, the most courageous act is letting go not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. We must remember that we are not defined by how others treat us, but by how we choose to treat ourselves in the face of betrayal or neglect. Choosing peace, walking away from toxicity, and building a life rooted in self-respect is not selfish, it's survival, and it's never too late to start.